I'm Carl Nagin with Free Speech TV, and my guest today is Greg Steltenpohl. And Greg is a very well-regarded and creative entrepreneur who started Odwalla Juices out of the back of a VW bus at the same time that he was an avant-garde jazz saxophone player after getting a degree at Stanford in environmental science. He took Odwalla to the point where it was a $100 million company, and he's now reinventing himself with a new company based at Califia Farms, and he's here to tell us a little bit about his new baby.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us, first of all, tell us a little bit of your Odwalla story and how you came to do that and why you came to do that and some of the business practices that you tried to pioneer there.
Sure, and thanks, Carl, for having me out here today. And
it's a pleasure.
Beautiful day at the Bioneers festival. I was 26 when Odwalla was started in 1980, and a bunch of my friends and I were pretty much the definition of starving musicians, and we had this brilliant insight that if things didn't go too well, if we got in the juice business, we got to just kind of live off the juice, so to speak. And
got juiced about juice.
So, and our fantasy was, of course, play music at night, do the juicing in the day, and, everything would be...
Real musicians have day jobs.
It would be groovy, right? For better or worse, the company really took off and consumed us, and most of us didn't end up sticking to the music. But it was early days in the natural food movement, and we were contemporaries with the rise of natural food retailing, which was just getting started, and this is even before Whole Foods, or just right around the time they were getting going. And also socially responsible business was just getting off the ground, and we were contemporaries. There was a group called Social Venture Network, which used to get together, and Ben and Jerry's were the Body Shop, really early members, seventh generation came out of that, and so there was a early peer group in which we started sharing ideas and so on. But by and large, we were ultra pioneers on the cutting edge of doing things a little bit differently in the food system, and trying to bring about environmental principles and ecological ideas into the food system. And so organic grew out of that. Biodynamic was brought over. Odwalla was a group of passionate people that was ready to embrace a lot of these ideas, like the natural step back in those days that Paul Hawken ended up running for a while. There was a place called Earth Island College, the first kind of environmental college for food in Central America. Of course, we had, along the way, a food safety crisis, which really transformed the company and ultimately kind of forced its sale. And as most people know, or might have known, it was ultimately sold to Coca-Cola. There was a lot of idealism in those days on our part, and certainly there was kind of different camps between people who were trained in corporate environments and then the passionate true believers of the natural food movement. So made a lot of mistakes back then, and I would say the biggest pioneering was really not so much becoming a smoothie king or something like that, but was more around company cultures and creating creative company cultures.
I was going to ask you about that, because that's one of the hallmarks of what you did back then, so what is that? Define that, spell that out for me, and how has that idea evolved in your mind over time?
Yeah, well, for me, it's an integrative function, and because of my own kind of environmental background, ecosystems are to me the should be the contextual thinking for anything,
Right.
and so. And even more, most so, the food system, since it's how we sustain ourselves. So it was really natural for me, but the overlay onto the way the industrialized food system had come to be was so different that it really took creative thinking in all these different avenues. So unless you had a culture of inquiry, you know,
Across
and
the company.
across the company, we were never going to be able to accomplish the vision. And the creative company cultures, I think a lot of it is meaning and values based. So
Yes.
um,
Not the bottom line, not short-term thinking, but
well,
long-term thinking.
triple bottom line. People. The profit is certainly part of it because that's part of how you sustain something. But the principles are, to me, the real DNA, and those are the things that make these companies so different. And that's why my current life, and as kind of turning into somewhat of a elder in a way,
Yeah.
of this, of young food companies and startups. I feel like finding ways to respect and promote these cultures and prevent their early or too early assimilation into the corporate or multinational food systems is one of the biggest challenges for successful food entrepreneurs. And also, it's some of the least thought about, um, a part of how people start things up.
Yes.
They tend to be product focused and think everything's all about the product.
They're not thinking about distribution. They're not thinking about their manufacturing process so much. So how does that work out?
Well, all those things come into play as you move down, the evolution of scaling something. And in my position, having been in the business for that long, since 1980, this is the area of most interest to me, is how can both myself and my own group at Califia, who are passionate about the mission, how can we create a scalable food and beverage company? And I like to call it a food and beverage company of the future.
Uh-huh.
And our particular mission is to nourish and inspire the world through the wisdom of plant-based beverages.
Fantastic.
And plant-based foods. And the planet can't sustain an animal-based diet or an animal-centric diet at the middle of the plate for much longer without overwhelming destruction to the lungs of the planet, in terms of what's happening in Central and South America around clear cutting and rainforest devastation, which is being driven in large part by, wanting more grazing area for animals. So it's not so much that we have to make vegans out of everybody, but we do need, and this is where personal change meets global change in such an actionable way. And the kind of facts, if you break it down to a carbon economy viewpoint, is that if we, each of us individually, eat in a standard American diet, the SAD situation,
sad.
Which we produce as a byproduct of that lifestyle about 2.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. So, and that's a very well measured fact. If we shifted to a vegan diet, which is more on the extreme, we would our footprint goes down by about to 1.5 tons per person. So we save a ton of carbon per year per person by shifting to a plant-centric diet. Now, having just started a new plant-based company called Califia Farms, I'd like to make a commercial that said, drink Califia Farms and save a ton of carbon. So drink a ton of Califia, save a ton of carbon. But obviously it's way more diverse than that. And but the principle is there. And and one of the things I'm really passionate about is getting people to understand this confluence between personal health and environmental health. And this is, if there was ever a win-win equation, that's not zero sum, it's that. Because whether it's diabetes, whether it's just having a strong immune system, having a low, a low footprint, any way you look at it, bringing plants into a more central role in your diet. And when we say, making this switch, a lot of it is literal, not just eating chips and things that you might have had as snacks and calling that plant-based, but it's really switching behaviors. So, instead of meat, having something on the middle of the plate that's plant-based, or switching, from dairy milk into, plant-based milk and so on.
Almond milk, other products like that. A lot of people like their coffee sweet, and you're involved in making a new coffee product that has a whole new process. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and thanks for bringing it up. It's one of my favorite topics in it. So our company, first of all, one of our mottos is something different, something better. So sounds simple, but it really provides a lot of guidance in product development. And if you ask yourself that hard question, you don't launch something unless it truly is something different and something better. So that's kind of one of the creative guiding posts for our company. And along that way, when we because coffee and milks are married at the hip, and we wanted to also transform coffee. So we got very passionate about a process called cold brewing. And
that's related to beer, as I understand it.
You can do it with beer. You can do it with many different things. You can do it with tea as well. But with coffee, it involves, it's kind of like slow food in that you've got to slow seep it, which is also how we do the almond milk too, by the way. We make a flour out of it and hydrate it in a tank and let it soak and absorb it, and eventually it kind of falls apart, and then just 100% of the almond dissolves into the milk.
Does that retain more of the nutrients of almonds?
It does, yeah. Yep. And it also gives our particular almond milk the creamy and kind of richer feel because there's a little more solids in there. But on coffee, this creative approach has less acid, so it allows, especially younger people who don't like that kind of bitter, when I give them sort of an entry point to coffee, it allows it to be a very pleasurable alternative to energy drinks, and you've got one ingredient, coffee beans and water, So we were very excited about it, and then applying, some of the innovation, we came up with or cross nitrogenization, which is...
That's a word I've never heard before.
It's just infusing nitrogen into the coffee when we package it. And this allows these tiny micro bubbles to be present in there, which give the coffee this whole milkshake type experience. And the big deal about that is it really is a different drinking experience. So it brings pleasure into it, and just kind of fun. But beyond that, it's a way that we can accomplish one of our other key principles, which is to lower sugar. And
how does nitrogen do that?
Well, when you put a little fat in there, like coconut milk, you end up with this unctuous and rich mouthfeel, which introduces a kind of satiety to, the experience, and you don't just want a whole bunch of it. It allows you to have a rich and fulfilling feeling, almost like a milkshake, but with none of the calories.
Fantastic.
So, and our average glass of our almond milk in 8-ounce glass has only 40 calories per serving. And this is how I got won over and converting from the juice business into the plant milk business was, juices have about 120 to 180 calories, and sometimes even more for smoothies. And these glasses, and a serving of plant milk has typically 40 to 50. So you've got.
What's the sugar content that we're dealing with when you break down when I buy my almond milk, I check how many grams of sugar.
Right. Well, there's actually very little. There's just a tiny, tiny bit of sugar because nuts don't really have much sugar, and the carbohydrate is mainly in the form of the fiber. So you're not really assimilating carbohydrates at all. So that's a great thing about plant milks as a general kind of important component of your diet because it's low carbohydrate by nature. Yeah.
You're working with a farm, as I understand it, in the Central Valley of California near Bakersfield. Is that correct?
Right. Well, one of the big challenges for me with financing food companies was always that pure money, but pure financial players who came into the food business and invest in it for a shorter term return don't have a long-term view. And if we're going to change the food system, we have to take a multi-generational perspective. Our ideas and the things that are hatched out of places like Bioneers need bridge builders that can speak both languages and also come into conversations with respect and so on. So that's another added kind of task.
Was there a story with how you connected with a particular farm that you're working with?
Ironically, I don't get credit for it at all because I put the lofty thing of partnering with farmers front and center because it was a latent intention that I had. But ironically, the opportunity came when one of these farmers called me up and he had a terrible food waste problem.
Wow.
And like any other good thing, it started with something that nobody else wanted. So there's a lesson embedded there. They had pioneered this. The Sun Pacific Farming Group had pioneered the launch of the Spanish clementine and this mandarin variety of tangerine that was popularized first in northern Africa, but then spread eventually here to California, and the California climate is ideal for it. So they had all these little easy peel, soft skin fruit, and then they had 20% of them, which was a lot. And at the time I partnered with them, that was 100,000 tons of fruit. So together we had to build a big processing facility, and we cleaned up and eliminated almost all that waste and transferred it into, a high antioxidant beverage. And
what's the beverage called?
Well, we were juicing pure tangerine juice.
Oh,
yeah.
Fantastic.
So, which has more vitamin C than orange juice. So that's how we got started.
That's
and
fantastic.
Then we pivoted to the plant milks, and now we're.
And this is Califia Farms.
Califia Farms, right?
Fantastic. And how long have they been around?
So we started the company in 2010, so it's our 7th year. We've been operating in plant milks for just over 5 years. The company is actually named after the namesake of California, and I'm going to make a little commercial for this because so few Californians actually know this fact.
Go for it.
But Queen Califia was a mythical queen that a Spanish novelist in 1500 created.
Fantastic.
And inspired by actual women warriors in North Africa. And
the caliphate comes from that word.
Right.
Probably.
So caliphate means leader.
Right.
And
Califia.
so Califia is a feminized version of it. And Queen Califia was a dark-skinned
Moorish warrior.
Well, he pictured her as Moorish, but Amazonian.
Yeah.
So and she led the matriarchal form of governance. They could communicate with animals and plants. So does it sound like California yet?
It sounds like Mother Earth rescuing us yet again.
So she's the inspiration for the company. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
What a great story.
Yeah.
Greg, thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to say about your future plans for this company and where you're going with it?
Sure. I just, I like anything that has a lot of intensity around the vision and, when we say food and beverage company of the future and transforming the food system, I mean, there are a lot of big ideas there, but it's building a company from scratch is an incredibly exhilarating kind of feeling when it happens to match this historical moment. And yes. In contrast to the 80s, we live in a time when I don't think the food system is up to speed like the consumer is. So it's a great time for change, and it's a great time for people to be able to support brands that are trying to do the right thing. I hope we can be around for a long, long time. That's certainly my intention. And I just encourage anyone who has, visions and dreams of doing something differently to go ahead and do it.
Greg Steltenpohl, thank you so much for being with Free Speech TV.